We're always trying to help our children to understand the big why in the world. The big part of moving away from control too is like helping kids understand why we are doing this or why this is important in a respectful way, helping them get the big picture.
You're listening to Parenting with Impact, a podcast for parents like you, raising complex kids to become capable, independent adults, even in this complicated world. Each episode brings expert insights and real-life strategies to help you parent with confidence, calm, and clarity. Here are your hosts, Elaine and Diane.
Welcome back, everybody, to another conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. I'm excited because I get to talk to Sarah Rosensweet. And we don't know what we're going to talk about, but it's going to be fabulous because every time we talk to each other, it's fabulous. So I'm excited to welcome my guest, Sarah Rosensweet. And you may know her from the Peaceful Parenting podcast. And we've had a chance in the last year or so to collaborate and be on each other's podcasts and summits. And it's always a really juicy conversation. So welcome, Sarah. It's great to have you.
Thanks. I was looking forward to speaking with you again today.
Yeah, me too. So tell us a little bit about how you got to be. So you're Reimagine Peaceful Parenting. That's your work in the world. How did you come to be doing this work?
Well, it started from a passion about parenting, really. I have 3 kids who are now 17, 20, and 23. And I was a stay-at-home mom for a little bit more than a decade. And I really just kind of threw my type A, love to learn personality into parenting. And I discovered the work of Alfie Kohn and some different people who were like the early, no rewards and punishments kind of peaceful parenting philosophy, and kind of some hippie magazines and things like that. And I just really loved sort of thinking about how we can raise kids and not that sort of conventional, make them feel bad to teach them a lesson and get them to control them and get them to do what you want. And I just kind of fell in love with that philosophy personally. And then when it was sort of my youngest went to kindergarten and it was time to get a job, I had been previously working in film and television, which I loved, but it was not conducive to being the kind of parent that I wanted to be because the hours were so long. And so I needed a new thing. And my husband said, why don't you start your own business? And that was 12 years ago. Then I started working as a parenting coach, did a ton of like professional development and training and certification. And I've just built it up since there and honestly learned from my community and my clients along the way. And where you and I intersect is through the complex kids lens. And what I found was that the sort of peaceful parenting approach, a lot of people with more complex kids thought, oh, well, that's nice for kids who don't have any, other challenges or the easy kids. But what my passion has grown to be was helping parents of complex kids know that, yes, you can use the peaceful parenting approach, even though you have complex kids and you might need additional tools and strategies, which is where your work comes in. But mine really comes, that's why we call it Reimagine Peaceful Parenting, because we really want to help folks understand that you can still use this approach and these philosophies with your kids who are more of the out-of-the-box kiddos.
Yeah, love. And you can see, folks, why we get along so well. I love that you call it hippie parenting, and it's not really. It's just, those of us who have that throwback tendency, but there is something about respect and kindness and seeing our kids as individual human beings. Diane and I often say positive parenting is absolutely essential. And to your point, it's not enough, right? There are other tools that we need with complex kids that make the difference. But if you don't have that positive parenting as a foundation, the tools don't work.
Yeah.
Like the positive framework is what allows everything else you need to do to empower these kids to take ownership of themselves. That's what allows it to happen, is the foundation of the relationship you have with them.
100%. I even would argue that it's more important to have that foundation with more complex kids because those are the kids who don't like being bossed around even more than just as an example of one thing that I find is like, sometimes complex kids can be more strong-willed than the average bear, right? And so even more, it's important to get away from the control mindset, right? And that power over mindset and the working with, and because you have to be flexible so much more when you have complex kids. And that's really baked into the approach, right? Is that collaboration and flexibility. So I think it's always the place to start. And what we always say to parents, and often parents come to us who don't yet. I mean, they might have a gut feeling that they have a complex kid, but they don't know those words for it, and they just know that they're having a hard time. And we often say, like, practice this approach for a few months. And if you're still having a hard time, that usually means that there's something else going on, that you need some additional tools.
Yeah. There's what's going on and then what's going on underneath
Hmm.
what's going on underneath that. So, and I couldn't agree with you more that when you have kids who are struggling with feeling out of control themselves for whatever reason, whether it's, a diagnosis or a traumatic experience or a parent who's not on the, who is not parenting from a framework that is supportive of them, whatever it is, and they're exerting control, whether that's by offense or defense or avoidance or whatever, those are the kids who really need us to be present to them and to help them find ways to exercise control in healthy ways instead of trying to control them. So let's
Hmm.
talk a little bit about control.
Yeah, and that's another reason why we've started talking about reimagining peaceful parenting. And actually, was just preparing a quote post about how we're moving away from using the words limits and boundaries. Not that we don't believe that you do need to have limits and boundaries in parenting, because of course you do. You need to, there's safety and health considerations and non-negotiables in every family. But what I started to feel worried about as this mode of parenting has become more popular, whether you want to call it gentle parenting, peaceful parenting, conscious, etc., is that there are parents out there who didn't totally understand the collaborative nature of the approach and the respectful nature of the approach, and that they were using our catchphrases of limits to basically just do sugar-coated control. I promise I would get back to control, and I just did.
No, I'm with you.
But that idea, when you start to use the words limits and boundaries, I fear, because I've seen this happening, that it's just like, well, I'm still going to control my child, but just in a nicer way. Like, I'm going to
Right?
control them, but with lots of empathy, right? Or I'm going to set a boundary that is because it's my preference, or because it makes life easier for me, or just because it's the idea that I like, but I'm going to do it in a nice way. So that's just one thing that we've been really talking about in my neck of the woods, about let's move away from even using those words, because I think it's can be a slippery slope. And instead, I really like to talk about collaboration. And just a shout out to my friend Vivek Patel, who has he has a YouTube channel where he talks a ton about non-coercive collaborative parenting. And his work has really influenced my work a lot. Just really thinking about how can we move away from control towards collaboration, right? And I just think that's the crux of it.
Yeah. And it's such a huge part of our model is, to move out of director and into collaborator. And we're so with you. And I love that notion of sugar-coated control. What I try to help parents understand is that positive parenting is not actually about being nice,
Hmm.
right? Positive parenting is about how you're being. Maybe we should talk about that a little bit, and then we'll get back to that control issue, because I think you really hit something that a lot of parents think, if I'm just nicer about it, what ends up happening is they kind of either roll over and let the kids run the roost in an unhealthy way, or they just are trying to speak nicely,
Hmm.
but that's not really what we're talking about.
Hmm.
So where do you go with that?
Well, first, it's just funny because I was almost going to tell you the story before, which you'll laugh at the way that I'm going to introduce this because of what we were talking about before we started recording, which is in this podcast that I was listening to. It's a podcast where they talked about do you remember the book, The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother? Amy Chua's book about basically the authoritarian parenting model. And there's a podcast where these two guys, it's called If Books Could Kill, and they go through they look at the research. They sort of pick apart the book and decide whether it's whether it's true or not true or whatever. And so I don't even think they have children, but they took on the model of authoritarian, permissive, and authoritative parenting, and looked
Okay.
at all the research and basically came down to that what we know, which is authoritative parenting, is what the research shows is the best outcome for children. That having the being the guide, like we're talking about. But the funny thing is, at the end of the podcast, they said, so basically, it just comes down to be nice to your kids. So I had to laugh when you said it's not about being nice, but I do know what you mean. But what they meant, honestly, I think is be respectful, right? Like
Yes.
treat your, what they meant. And when I think of being nice in a good way, is that you're treating your child how you would treat another adult, like the same respect. Like you're not going to say to your partner, dinner's ready. And if they don't come to the table that split second, you don't walk over to them and slam their laptop shut when they're in the middle of a work meeting, right? So I do, but at the same time, being nice doesn't mean that you never want to, for children at least, there are times where you are going to set limits that they're unhappy with. And there are, you're not going to buy them every toy at Toys R Us when you go to buy a birthday present for their cousin because you're trying to avoid that they're going to be sad and upset, right? So being nice, yes, in terms of being respectful and treating a child the way you would want to be treated or that you might treat another adult, but being nice in terms of trying to avoid difficult feelings, no. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's really a great way to capture it. It is about showing respect to them as a separate autonomous human being and acknowledging that even if they're children, they have their own way of looking at the world, they have their own wants, they have their own interests, and that their lens on the world is legitimate.
Hmm.
Right? We don't wanna discount it just because it's not our agenda. We talk a lot about agenda, right?
Yeah,
Whose
me too.
agenda is it? Right? And collaboration is about sharing an agenda, and then ideally, you move into a support role where it's their agenda. But if you're the one holding the reins so tight, why should they bother?
Yeah, yeah. I think, well, two thoughts on that. One is I think a lot of this mode of parenting is moving away, or at least always thinking about how adult centric our culture is, right? That the needs and preferences of adults are often placed above the needs and preferences of children. And that doesn't mean that now in our model, the needs and preferences of children are above the needs and preferences of adult, but it's the collaboration piece again. So that's the one thing that I think of. And then the other thing that I think of is stop what you're doing, drop your agenda, even just for a moment, just, forget trying to get them to get their shoes on just for a minute and then just breathe so you can bring yourself back to centered. And a parent that I worked with once said, I really realized that I have to drop my agenda no matter how awesome I think it is, which it just cracked me up because that's the problem so much of the time is that we think our agenda is like so awesome that we just want to hold on to it, right? But just being willing to look at it from a different point of view or be flexible is so important.
Oh, so true. All right, we're gonna take a quick break, and that made me think of a great question I wanna ask when we come back.
Do you recognize current ADHD interventions fall short? At Dig Coaching, we have developed a new field of engineering and a new ADHD intervention called cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. To learn more, visit cognitive-ergonomics.com.
Welcome back, everybody. My guest is Sarah Rosensweet, and we are talking about all kinds of things. Collaboration, really, at the foundation of what it means to really be positive parenting. And we were talking about agenda and shared agenda versus dropping the agenda. We always ask the question, whose agenda is it? Right? That's kind of our catchphrase. And this notion of it's not about having an adult-centric view of the world or a child-centric view of the world, but it's about the collaboration and the merging of the two. That's what, because we're really looking for relationships
Mhm.
in our family dynamic. The question I wanted to ask you about, now I lost my thought, in terms of this whole notion of stop, drop, and breathe is about this notion of agenda. Like when we think we have a great agenda, but our agenda, oh, I know what it was. It's that oftentimes what we like to say is that as parents, our agenda is often motivated by wanting for our kids. We
Mhm.
want for them to learn what they need to learn. We want for them to be successful. We want whatever it is. We think we want for them. But what ends up happening is we end up wanting from them.
Mhm.
It leads to expectations and all kinds of um, ways that we set agendas that are ours, not theirs. So I'm wondering how that lands for you and what your thoughts are around that.
I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're talking about, but I've been thinking a lot about the idea that there's more than one path to a good life.
Mhm.
And that's what I think sometimes when you said wanting for them, that's what I thought of, that we want them to have a good life, right? We want, and in our culture, there's often just like that one perceived path. And I know in your book, you talk about this a lot, that sort of that there's more than one path to a good life. And I think that when we have an agenda, that's a good thing to stop and think about. Because when I mentioned the drop your agenda, we might drop it forever, or we might drop it for just a minute and decide that is something that we want to come back to. But it's the thoughtful piece, right? We stop and think about like, what is my agenda? Is it necessary? Is it important? Is it something that my child needs or that I need? But it's just that thoughtfulness. And so I think that often our agenda, when we get locked in, we're operating from a place of fear. And I think that fear, the big ultimate fear is, I want my child to have a good life. And we worry like, oh, they're screaming and shouting and kicking and hitting when they're 7. What are they going to be doing when they're 17? Are they going to be in juvie? And what if they're 27 and they're like abusive to their partner, right? And so we just think about that fear. I think that fear gets in the way so much of the time with our agenda and with our ultimate desire that our child has a life that is good for them, that works for them.
Right. We're catastrophizing to what the risks might be and kind of working back to, so we have to change it right now.
Mm-hmm.
Just not particularly helpful. So let's let that transition us into a conversation about control, because I think both of us in our work are looking at, it's not that control is a bad thing, but that it's about controlling that becomes a problem. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think self-control is is a good
Exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
And that we can really remember that we're the only person that we can control, is ourselves. And so really dropping that, I don't know, I'm repeating myself, but coming back to the idea of collaboration versus control, like, only person we can control is ourselves. And how can we, a lot of it, I think, also has to do with guiding our kids in terms of giving them information that they might be lacking. I love thinking of the idea of parenting as like, you're leading a tour group in Thailand and the people there don't speak the language, and the people on your tour group don't speak Thai and they don't know about the local customs. And we're always trying to help our children / tour group members to understand the big why in the world and, give them those missing pieces of information. And I think that that is a big part of moving away from control too, is like helping kids understand why we are doing this or why this is important, or why in a respectful way, helping them get the big picture.
As I hear you say that, one of the tools that we play with a lot is asking permission. And
Mm,
the technique we talk about is ask, don't tell.
mm,
And as I hear you saying that, it's like you can tell your tour group anything because they have chosen to be in the tour group.
mhm,
And I think what the work that we're about and you're about is that when your kids is enrolling your kids in wanting to be in that tour group, right? It's
mhm.
inviting them to, I have a thought, would you like to hear it? Do you want to understand what's behind it? So that the word that's coming to me is enrolling them
Yeah.
as opposed to telling, because telling is going to shut down a kid faster than anything. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I often in my work talk about what I call the Goodwill Bank account,
Okay.
where one of the ways to have a nice big beefy Goodwill Bank account, which is sort of how I think of the influence that we have over our child, right? Like how much they trust us, how much they care what we think, which I mean, you and I both have older children, so we know how important that is when you have teenagers, right? If they don't
Right.
care what you think, you're in big trouble. But part of that is starting from when they're young and like building up this beefy goodwill bank. And that's, I think, what you're talking about with enrollment. Correct me if I'm wrong, but just really having that really nice, those nice deposits that come through like listening to kids and trying to take their preferences and needs into account, and being not power tripping and arbitrary and controlling, but just really having that big beefy goodwill bank.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a great way to frame it.
Is that what
And
you meant by enrolling?
it's part,
Like,
yeah, a big part of it is,
yeah.
but it's not just the big picture enrolling in that Goodwill Bank account, which I love, but the
Mhm.
momentary enrollments, and maybe I am
Mhm.
thinking a little bit more about teenagers, but in that moment of, we have the tendency of, there's something I want to teach you, right? And what we haven't stopped to think, do they want to be taught?
Yeah.
Are they receptive to this moment of teaching? And if they're not, we're just we're just lecturing. And I'm sure you've had this too, where you talk to a parent, you're coaching a parent, and parents like, yeah, then I went into lecture mode and I knew it wasn't going to make a difference, but I just couldn't stop myself.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because we have that tendency, because there are things we want them to know and understand.
Yeah. 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 I
Um,
mean, it's so frustrating as a parent to not be able to just directly put all of our experience into our kids' brains, right? Like that, my joke in my family is if everyone would just let me run their lives, they'd be so much happier. Right. But I think of that Mark Twain quote that good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. And so much of parenting, especially
Experience comes from bad judgment.
yeah,
Sorry.
isn't that great?
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Yes.
good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. And so much of parenting is really like, what I often would say to my kids or tell my clients to say to their kids is, I have some thoughts on that. Are you interested in them? And
Right.
a lot of times they say, no, I don't want to know your thoughts on that. And then you have to just shut up, right? Even though you have such great thoughts and such great ideas. But if we always are stepping in, either they're going to shut down or they're going to not get the experience that they need.
Right. Well, and if they say no and you honor that, the next time you offer, they're more likely to say yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? You got to build that trust. You
Yeah.
gotta, you know, fill up that tank, because their trust becomes so essential. Right.
Yeah, I mean, if I could share a quick story, my daughter, my youngest, she's 17. This happened almost a year ago. My husband and I were going to be out of town for a week, and she was staying home alone with her older brother. And she said, she was a junior in high school at the time. And she said, I've been invited to a party that's going to be happening while you're away. And I said, oh, tell me more about this party. And
Right.
she said her friends were not invited and she didn't really know the girl whose party it was. And I said, gee, you know, that sounds like a little bit tricky since Daddy and I are not going to be here in town if you need anything, right? We're going to be in Mexico. And I said, if one of those things were different, you were going with friends or if it was someone you knew really well, I would feel a lot better about you going to this party, but it's making me feel a bit nervous about it. And she said, yeah, you're right, Mom. I don't think I'm going to go. But it was because she trusted me that I have her best interests at heart, right? She could have snuck out. She didn't. But she really I didn't tell her and I also didn't tell her she couldn't go. Like I didn't say, you can't go to that party. I said, these are my concerns about it. And she was like, oh, wow, you're right. This something doesn't sound like a good idea.
Yeah. And that there's a beautiful openness to that and a trust that you've done a lot of work building.
Mm-hmm.
So to those listening who are like, my kid would never do that, I want to remind you that you don't get here on a dime, right?
Yeah.
There's a process and a pace. You have to kind of pace yourself to begin to parent differently and to engage with your kids differently. Often, and we've got another podcast episode about this, actually, I think. I feel like sometimes we fall out of trust with them and they fall out of trust with us and they fall out of trust with themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the work of, whether it's with us or Sarah working with a parenting coach, getting the training to be conscious in the parenting, collaborative parenting, is to build the trust with yourself as a parent so that you can cultivate that trust with them.
What does that look like to you, building trust with yourself as a parent?
I think it's a lot of what we're talking about. It's to trust myself it's almost, you have to trust your kids to trust yourself on some level.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have to believe that they're capable.
Yeah.
That they don't need me to step in and make sure everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I have to trust that we can handle it if it doesn't go okay.
My husband's been worrying about, especially my husband and me a little bit too, about one of our children who's just finished university and is kind of in that what next,
I have one of those
pre-life crisis sort of thing. And just last night I said to my husband, we have to trust that he wants his life to work out, which is a line I got from Ned Johnson, Self-Driven Child. He wants his life to work out. And, he might be going through like a little bit of floundering right now, but he wants his life to work out. And I think that is such a huge leap of trust when you're worried about a child, no matter what age they are.
I love that. And here's what I'll offer, because I have a 23-year-old in a similar state. And my line to him has always been, yeah, I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm confident that you're going to land on your feet because you always
Yeah. And I
That's been
feel
my
that. I feel that. I love that line and I feel that in my heart, but I've been doing this work for a long time and my husband's a lawyer. So
Yes.
he's in a different spot, right?
Well, I will tell you that my son has surprised us all and has chosen a path in the last couple of weeks, and is like signed up for a course and is planning to take a professional exam. And I'm not going to share what he's doing yet, but he's surprised all of us.
Very cool.
But I do believe that a lot of it has to do with all he's ever heard is, I don't know what you're going to do, but you're going to figure it out and you're going to land
Mhm.
solid enough.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
and that starts when they're small, right? Like,
yeah,
starts when they're small, and that again, I'm coming back to that control piece. When you're not controlling a child, you're building that muscle of them figuring it out, right? Of course, they need guidance. I don't want to come off like we're being permissive here. Of course, they need guidance. But when you're not controlling and stepping in and saying, no, don't do it that way, you're going to spill, right? Or, you can't carry that thing, it's too heavy. Then you're sending the message of, you can't figure it out. You're not going to figure this out.
yeah. And the message we really want to be sending above all else is, bring it on. You've got this. Whatever it
Hmm.
is, you can handle it. And that's, you asked me a minute ago, what do I think it is as a parent to trust ourselves? And that's I call it the bring it on attitude,
Love it.
right? Whatever comes at me, I can handle it. And
Love it.
that's what I want parents to understand, is that we really are resilient just like they are. And we can
Hmm.
handle it just like they are. And we don't have to know, right?
Love that. Yeah.
So there's so much more I would love to talk to you about, but we really do have to wrap this conversation. You guys,
Well, you're going to come on my podcast, so we'll continue the conversation on the
continue
Peaceful
the
Parenting podcast.
awesome. So, folks, you can find out more about Sarah Rosensweet. She has the Peaceful Parenting podcast, wherever you podcast, which is delightful. And all of her resources at reimaginepeacefulparenting.com. All the links are in the show notes. Encourage you to check her out. Amazing stuff. Sarah, what do you want to button this conversation with? Is there something you want to highlight or something we haven't said that you want to share?
I love that. I mean, what I want to highlight is that we're talking about the build, right? From all the things that we do when they're little to, how that builds as they get older. And I also want to say that it's never too late. So, you mentioned that when I told that story about my daughter, that some people would be like, my kid would never do that. Your kid always wants to have a good relationship with you. And there are adults who want to have better relationship with their adult parents. Like I don't think it ever goes away that your child wants to have a better relationship with you. And even if they act prickly, they still want you and they still need you. So if you haven't been doing this from the early years, it's never too late. I guess that's one thing I just wanted to highlight. It builds and it's never too late.
I love, love, love that. Couldn't agree more. There is no child on the planet who doesn't want to have a relationship with their parent if they can,
Mm-hmm.
right? And whether they can or not has to do with whether they feel safe, and that has to do with how you receive them.
Yeah, I mean, warmth. I just stress to parents all the time. Like, the most important thing is a warm relationship with your child, right? Like, just giving them the sense that you like them and love them, and
Yeah,
that's a good place to start.
absolutely. So much I could say. You have a favorite quote or motto you want to share?
Yeah, this underpins my work and my life, which is they're doing the best they can. I really think that has carried me through some hard moments, including, things that are going on in the world. Really just trying to, it's hard to believe sometimes about adults. I never have trouble believing it about children. But I do believe that people are doing the best they can, and that makes me feel better as a person, and it helps me hold space for the people that I work with and for their children in their lives. And I just really think that people are doing the best they can.
I love that. Beautiful. Thank you. I talk a lot about up until now, right? The three things that can change in the world is you can't do anything about what's happened in the past, and that people do the best they can with what they've got.
Hmm.
And ideally, when they know better, they can do better.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not to say that people don't do awful. Yeah. It's not to say that sometimes people don't do awful things,
Yeah.
but we've got to just look at, what you said, the tools and resources that they had at their disposal, or, what happened to them, right?
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah,
Thanks for having me.
here. Thanks for what you're doing in the world. Thanks for being such a delightful presence.
Thanks, Elaine.
It's a pleasure. To those of you listening, take a minute, check in with yourself. What's your insight from the conversation that Sarah and I have been having? We talked about control and about collaboration and about, non-coercive parenting and peaceful parenting. What are you taking away from this conversation? What's your insight or your aha? And how do you want to apply it in your week moving forward? Is there a conversation you want to have, a person you want to share it with? What do you want to do with this insight that you've got? And as always, my friends, thank you for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. You make an enormous difference. Please stay tuned or tune in or click forward to the next conversation. Diane and I are going to be jamming on something going on in our community. Always interesting to see what comes up, what's been coming up that we want to bring to you to talk about some of the current issues in parenting. And until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye, everybody.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.